entering fully into who you're creating us to be. No matter what anybody says, no matter what opposition we may face, whatever hurdles may come our way, withholding nothing, entering fully into your glory, into your power, moving beyond pretending into wisdom, into revelation. Amen. For this word, spirit of wisdom and revelation, opening the eyes of our hearts so that we can see the hope to which we are called. Sometimes it's so hard to see that hope. That hope is covered up by fog. It's covered up by circumstances. It's covered up by pain. But opening the eyes of our hearts, allowing the wisdom and the revelation to take us beyond pretending. In 1989, I was 33 years old, and I was headed to my 15th high school reunion. Mercy. Now, I went through some stuff in high school. I had some issues in high school that had never been resolved. And walking up to that venue, thinking of all the changes I'd been through since I graduated, thinking about how am I going to connect with these people that I wasn't all that connected with 15 years ago. And I came up and I had the first conversation, and we exchanged a little small talk, and then she said, "So what are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, I'm a United Methodist minister." And she said, "Hey, Jen, how you doing? It's good to see you. The kids are getting so big." I went through that a couple more times. Each time we would get to that place in the conversation and I would say, "Minister," there would be this kind of daze that would come over people's eyes, this kind of confusion, this kind of dislocation, and then it would be the end of the conversation. So I thought I'd switch. You know, I was actually working for a human rights group at the time, so I thought I would try that. So the next conversation when we got to that point, I said, "Yeah, I'm working with a human rights organization." Same thing. So I saw Rick. Rick was this guy I was never that close to, but he was more open than most people I knew in high school. So we started having this conversation, and you know, eventually we got to this place, and he said, "So what you up to these days?" And I told him the whole thing. I said, "Yeah, I went to seminary, and I became a minister, and I've been living in the Philippines for a few years. Now I'm working with this human rights organization." I kind of went into the whole thing, and Rick heard that, and he said, "Yeah, you know, I had an uncle once who was a Jesuit, and he was in Brazil for a while, and we had a conversation. We really talked for real, and he started sharing for real what he was about." And 29 some years later, after that night, as I look back on that night, I do not remember who I was talking to who rejected me. I remember the experience, but I don't remember who I was talking to. But I remember the details of that conversation I had with Rick. Because I experienced in that moment a way to belong as who I am, fully as who I am. I experienced the power of belonging. Now I want to invite you to think about any situations that you've been in where you've been tempted to share some of who you are, but hold back some of who you are that you're afraid might not be accepted. I mean, who wants to be hurt or disrespected? It just gets tiring to have to explain yourself to people. pretending is common. And it sometimes provides us some comfort, and sometimes it's just necessary. But pretending as a way of life does not lead to hope. Rather, hope comes from being able to dig down into the depths and to be able to live fully into who God has created us to be. So we're continuing our sermon series on hope today, hope in the midst of troubled times. And we're exploring the first chapter of Ephesians, verses 17 and 18. These verses that we read this morning are so powerful that we're going to be in them for the next 3 weeks. We're going to go in today on verse 17, and then we'll go on the other two, because there is so much in these verses for our times. I pray that God give you a spirit of wisdom and revelation, so that with the eyes of your heart enlightened, you may know what is the hope to which God has called you. This week we're going to focus particularly on verse 17. Particularly on these words, wisdom and revelation. We're going to look at what it is to get beyond pretending. And this is the particular path. The path of wisdom and revelation is the path that takes us beyond pretending into that place where, with the eyes of our hearts open, we can begin to glimpse the hope, the real hope to which God has called us. So to start off with moving beyond pretending, let's look a little bit at what pretending's about. Where does pretending come from? Let's get deep into why it is that there are times when we feel like we need to project a certain image. Have you been in that situation where you feel like you project a certain image? I experienced that when I was a parent. I wanted to set a certain example for my children. I had certain teachings that I was trying to get them to internalize, and I wanted to try to reflect those in my own behavior. And I remember one time early in our move to Brooklyn, and I was trying to adjust myself to the way people drive in Brooklyn. This was a new experience for me, and it was a bit frustrating. And I remember one particular experience when some guy came around me on the right on a one-lane road and cut in front of me, and I uttered a couple of sentences in a rather agitated manner that included some rather colorful language. And then I looked in the rearview mirror and I saw my 10-year-old daughter sitting in the back seat. And I saw the look on her face, as if the image I had been sharing with her was no longer as viable as it had been. And I felt ashamed. I felt like I had let myself down. I felt like I had let her down. So the question is, when we have this image, when we have this idea of who we are and who we project ourselves to be, what happens when you don't measure up to the expectations of others, or when you don't measure up to the expectations that you have for yourself? Well, I think that's when we begin to manage our image. If we want people to see us as strong, we might say that we're okay even though we're not okay. If we're trying to move into some new job or come into some kind of new way of being or got some kind of thing we're trying to make happen and we're not really sure what we're doing yet, we don't feel confident yet, sometimes you just got to fake it till you make it. And sometimes that's true. I mean, to be honest, pastors are a bit prone to pretending. I mean, standing up here preaching holiness week after week, I feel a certain responsibility not to be a hypocrite. But what happens when I'm going through a rough patch? What happens when I'm not measuring up? What happens when my prayer life is not all I need it to be? Now, sometimes we may need to do a little pretending, but it's a slippery slope. Because in pretending, we're stepping away from what's real. And if I'm pretending regularly, then I stop growing. How can I make the changes I need to make in my life if I'm not able to confront the reality of what's going on in my life? How can I be a real friend and a real partner if there's things about me that I'm hiding? So the first chapter of Ephesians offers us a path beyond pretending. A prayer that you may receive a spirit of wisdom and revelation, so that with the eyes of your heart enlightened, you may know what is the hope to which God is calling you. A spirit of wisdom and revelation opens our hearts and helps us to see the hope that's real. So one thing wisdom does is it connects with our heart. You know, my brain may be rationalizing a certain situation. My brain may be going 1,000,000 miles a minute. I'm calculating the situation. I'm saying that if I say this person's going to do that. If I say this, they're going to turn away. My brain is thinking, but my heart knows what's real. And if I deviate too far from what's real, my heart is going to let me know. On Friday, my wife and my daughter Lisa and I were sitting in the living room. I was working on my sermon. I was getting to a little rough patch, and God decided I needed a little stimulation, so they had this conversation. And Lisa was telling her mother about this conference she had gone to and this incredible scholar that she had met. She was so impressed with this person. This person was the president of a seminary. This person has just taken on this really huge job. This person was so awesome, and yet he was humble, and they had a real conversation. At least it was so impressed with him. And Becky looked at her and said, I'm at a stage in my life where I'm just not impressed with people. But she said, I can be moved. And I found that such a powerful distinction. What would happen if we were less carried away with being impressed by people and more open to being moved? Now, I don't think there's necessarily a contradiction between being impressive and being moved, although they sometimes can work at cross purposes. I think, for example, of Michelle Alexander, who is somebody I'm very impressed with. I'm very impressed with the incredible work she's done, the well-researched, the well-written book, The New Jim Crow, that has just been so impactful in the world for all the right reasons. The integrity of her scholarship. Professor of law at Ohio State University, tenured professor. I mean, that is an impressive woman. But she also moves me. I mean, when she took a leave or left her position at Ohio State University to come to Union Theological Seminary, to come into a field that she has, and at the level of law, she is the boss. But to come into a seminary setting because she believes in the depth of her heart right now that we are not going to move forward through policy alone. We're not going to move forward through public advocacy alone, that there has to be some theology, there has to be some meaning, there has to be a new morality. And was genuinely moved to the point that she would leave all of that to come into a new setting, to give who she is and what she has into this new setting. That's moving to me. That's inspiring to me. And one of the things I think about in this distinction between impressing and moving is that impressing is a lot of what we do. It's a lot of what we accumulate on our resume. It's a lot of our accomplishments, the things that we've done. But moving is what kind of moves us beyond ourselves. Moving is when we take a step into new territory, when we're moving in faith, when we're out beyond what we control and we're into the realm of faith. In Ephesians, wisdom is connected to opening to mystery. In this same first chapter, before we get to the verses that we're reading for today, in verse 8 we read, "With all wisdom and insight, God has made known to us the mystery of God's will." This is beyond our control. This is faith. This is moving into deep waters. Wisdom also leads us into faith community. I mean, if you're impressive enough, you may be able to do it on yourself, all by yourself. But moving means understanding that we need that which is what beyond us. We need to connect with God. We need to connect with faith community. In Ephesians 3, chapter 3, verse 9, we read, "Through the church, the wisdom of God in its rich variety might be made known." The faith community is a place where the wisdom, as it speaks through each of us in different situations, through our different perspectives in our different situations, can be made known in all of its rich variety. And many of us experienced this variety, this richness, in our living faith this past Wednesday. This is our midweek Bible reflection group, meets the first and third Wednesday of the month. And this past week, Pastor Alexis, with everything going on, with all the catastrophes, so at that moment, so ripe. I mean, that was the moment that the hurricane had just hit Puerto Rico and many other countries in that region. People didn't know for sure. Many people hadn't even heard from their folks yet. But just simply opened the space to sharing what's on your heart. And in that space, we began to experience revelation, a revealing of that which we so often keep inside. So often we carry these incredible burdens around with us. Burdens of worry, burdens of fear, burdens of inadequacy, burdens of shame, all these feelings that we carry with us individually, carrying them on our own as if nobody else is experiencing what we're experiencing, feeling isolated from one another. So in that space, as he just opened the floor to share what's on your heart, people began to reveal the depths. Family members in Puerto Rico that they hadn't heard from were worried about, deeply, deeply worried about. Concerns about the direction of the planet. As climate change becomes more and more real, as it begins to unleash more and more devastating storms, imagining what life looks like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road. And in that open space, in that space of revealing, there was a wisdom that was flowing out among us that was so powerful. Now, there are good reasons why we sometimes don't reveal. There are many reasons why we pretend. There are many reasons why we say it's okay when it's not okay. One of the main reasons is mistrust. If I'm in a situation where I cannot trust that what I reveal to somebody is going to be listened to carefully, is going to be respected deeply, is going to be handled with care, then it may be difficult for me to just kind of put stuff out there. I mean, people can be judgmental, people can be insensitive. So I need a space where I can reveal. I need a space of trust. I need to be with people who I have built a trust with that I can say what's real about. Now, one of the reasons that we have conversation circles in worship, we actually invite people to go to the table and talk with one another and share from your heart and allow the word to move freely, It's because we feel like we want to be intentional about creating spaces of sharing. We want to be intentional about building trust. We want to be intentional about building a community of faith. A community of faith is so critical in this life that we're leading. It's so critical in these troubling times. It's such an essential source of hope. So it's so important to get to a place where we can reveal, because one of the things that begins to happen is there begins to be a revelation of God's love. We begin to discover that in the sharing of what's real, that we begin to encounter a presence of God that, as the scriptures often say, is more viably, visibly, powerfully present when we're going through the wilderness, when the mask is off, when the shield is down, when we realize that we can no longer do this on our own, that we're no longer able to do all of it. And as we open ourselves to these resources that are beyond, we begin to encounter the presence of God, the love of God. I pray that you may have a spirit of wisdom and revelation so that with the eyes of your heart enlightened, you may know what is the hope to which God has called you. We can get in that place where it's hard to see our way through. We may start pretending so we don't particularly or completely collapse, but the prayer is that we would open ourselves to wisdom and revelation so that with the eyes of our heart enlightened, God has called you for hope. This is our calling. Our calling is not despair. Our calling is not frustration. Our calling is not to operate on 3 syllables when we were built with 6. Our calling is not to do something that is not our full passion. Our calling is hope. And we need to have the eyes of our hearts open so that we can be enlightened to the particular hope that God is calling us. Can we believe that even in the midst of the storm? God can make a way even when we can't see one. Can you believe that even in the midst of the storm? You don't have to pretend that things are okay. They may not be okay, but God can lead you through anyway. Can we believe that even when we're in the midst of the storm, even when you're going through it? Gracious God, this is our prayer. That we may receive your spirit of wisdom. That we may enter into your spirit of revelation of what is real and what is true. That with the eyes of our hearts open, we may encounter the hope to which you are calling us. Amen.